My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
So far in this series, we have traced heavy metal's origins back to the proto-metal and heavy blues bands that provided the inspiration for the birth of the genre, and then we examined the formation and career of what's generally agreed to have been the first true heavy metal band, Black Sabbath. From there, we then traced the initial growth of heavy metal into an actual style of music with the new wave of British heavy metal or Nawabum bands. Groups that, even though many did not become household names themselves, would provide a kind of blueprint and inspiration for bands to come. Most notably, they would inspire a wide array of musicians in the United States who would follow one of two basic paths. Those being, of course, the path of the MTV darling glam/hair metal bands, or that of the heavier, more aggressive thrash bands like Slayer, Megadeth, and of course Metallica. As we now enter into the 90s, then metal will continue to evolve. We in particular, though, will be focusing on the heavier bands coming out of the Seattle scene that would ultimately prove to be the undoing of the hair metal crowd, as well as the underground, more extreme and brutal variations of metal that were also being created around this time. This will also notably serve as the last episode in this series, as following this, metal really begins to fragment into a bunch of different styles with no real dominant movements, other than quote-unquote new metal, which I'm not sure if it warrants this style of overview, or if we would be better served, if people are interested, with more of just looking at individual bands and or albums. I, after all, have already done an episode on System of a Down, and I figure groups like Korn and Slipknot could warrant their own episodes considering how influential they were/are. Regardless, before I get started, first, like always, I want to give credit to my sources, which include John Waterhorn and Catherine Turman's Louder Than Hell, The Definitive Oral History of Metal, Ian Christie's The Complete Headbanging History of Heavy Metal, and Greg Prado's Grunge is Dead, The Oral History of Seattle Rock Music. Additionally, I also relied upon articles written by the likes of Ryan O'Connell, Michael Azarad, Rick Marin, Robert Hilburn, Jacqueline Grambush, Jeff Stetson, Shireen Bryzak, Peter Steinfels, Richard N. Ostling, Sam Dunn, John Waterhorn, Chad Childers, Edward Rivadavia, Sabi Rice Kulkarni, Jeff Cornell, Dave Everly, and Brad Engel, all of which can be found listed on the podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all of that being said, let's begin. As we enter the 90s, Metallica was bringing thrash to the masses with their latest album And Justice for All, which, despite how heavy, harsh-sounding, and technical it was, actually made it into the top 10 of the Billboard charts. Sales figures that helped to ensure they would be nominated for a Grammy Award, which of course would be won by Jethro Tull, because when you think heavy metal, you think Jethro Tull. Yet, even if the music industry was slow to give them their due, Metallica was selling out arenas regularly. Unquestionably then, they had arrived, but now they would also change. Now, the reason for this change in sound and direction are various and debated. Some say they simply sold out, which I don't think is quite fair, but an interest in becoming the biggest band in the world may have played a part in it. Others point primarily to the death of bassist and guiding light Cliff Burton, who was so instrumental to their development, which I do think was a massive factor. Metallica themselves, meanwhile, point to a pair of factors that came to light while they were on tour. The first reason being they found they did not really enjoy playing the highly technical, long, complex songs they had written for And Justice for All. It was all a bit too much, it seemed. Meanwhile, they would also claim that due to the acoustics of the larger arenas they suddenly found themselves playing in, slower songs like For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Thing That Should Not Be were getting better reactions than the rapid-fire pure thrash songs like Blackened. Now, how true this is and how much is it a kind of convenient excuse to explain their change in direction, I cannot say, as I was not there. Regardless, when they entered the studio again to work on their next album, they wanted to craft songs that would appeal to the stadium show crowds. At the same time, Metallica would also famously do something different by allowing a producer to have more control over them in the studio. This producer, of course, being none other than Bob Rock, who at the time was famous for working with Motley Crue and Bon Jovi. Rock then was instrumental in convincing Metallica to write shorter, more simplistic songs. Now again, I personally can't help but wonder if this was another case of the band missing the creative voice of Cliff Burton and finding a surrogate in their producer. Nevertheless, the band welcomed the change and believed they had pushed as far as they could in the thrash metal direction with And Justice for All, and so they welcomed this new course. The result of these recordings would become known as the Black Album. Yet while hit singles like Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters would lead to even more success, the change in the band's overall direction would disappoint some longtime fans. Gone were the rapid-fire palm-muted riffs, and in their place were deliberately slower, simpler passages. The number of riffs per song would also decrease dramatically with this new release. It was a somewhat perplexing situation. Essentially, Metallica had gotten popular with no-nonsense, complex thrash metal. Yet, once they had reached the peak of the music world in terms of popularity, they abandoned many aspects of the music that had gotten them there. Despite of, or even because of this dramatic change, the Black Album would debut at number 1 on the Billboard charts and would go double platinum within 2 weeks. To support this new album and to capitalize on their newfound success, Metallica would depart on a massive 300-date world tour, which for the US leg in particular they looked to make it the biggest show of all time, as they partner with another of the biggest bands in America, Guns N' Roses, for a multi-platinum heavy metal team-up. A plan that makes sense on paper. They were two of the biggest bands on the planet. They both played an aggressive form of heavy metal that obviously connected with a ton of people. You essentially then had the biggest thrash band and the biggest band to come out of the glam metal ranks combining forces. This should have been the biggest and best concert tour possibly ever. Unfortunately, Axl Rose's increasingly temperamental behavior was causing problems both behind the scenes and on stage, as delays and cancellations became a common problem. This was enough of an issue by itself, but it would soon combine with another incident to create a kind of perfect storm. Disaster, you see, would strike on the 9th of August 1992 in Montreal, when James Hetfield, guitarist and lead singer of Metallica, wandered upstage while playing Fade to Black. Something he wasn't supposed to do, as his path put him directly in the middle of the pyrotechnics as they were going off. James would then suffer second-degree burns to his face, hands, arms, and legs. Indeed, Hetfield was so badly burned, his skin, according to Jason Newsted, was visibly bubbling up as he looked on helplessly. Hetfield then would be rushed to the hospital, leaving Lars to explain the situation to the fans. Now, what this all essentially meant was, on that night, Guns N' Roses were going to have to pick up the slack and ensure the huge crowd would go home happy. And with what I've told you about Guns N' Roses, and especially Axl's behavior on this tour, you should be confident in them doing exactly that. Or they could take the stage for barely a few minutes before Axl ultimately stormed off back to the dressing rooms, complaining of a sore throat as he refused to perform anymore. A sore throat that apparently did not stop him from smoking and drinking champagne backstage, as witnessed by Jason Newsted, while all hell was breaking loose in the stadium. You see, the people in attendance were quite upset that rather than seeing an epic concert featuring two of the biggest bands in the world, they got instead 2 short sets that both cut off abruptly. In their rage, a number of these angry concert-goers then started trashing the Montreal Olympic Stadium. As they did, things soon devolved into a riot. Cars would be overturned, 8 policemen and at least 10 people in the crowd would be injured, and the stadium itself would suffer some $300,000 of damage. Meanwhile, even with Metallica's success, glam metal was still going strong in the early 90s. In 1990, for example, Winger would be nominated for an American Music Award for the Best New Heavy Metal Band, and they would follow that up with the release of their second album, In the Heart of the Young, which would go platinum. Warrant, meanwhile, would release their best-known and highest-selling album Cherry Pie in 1990, not to mention the fact that bands like Cinderella and Poison would also release platinum-selling albums after the new decade started. Then there was the aforementioned Guns N' Roses, who would also release the Use Your Illusion double album in 91, an album that debuted at number 2 on the Billboard charts despite Kmart and Walmart not stocking it because of profanity concerns from our old friends the PMRC. Also in 1991, Skid Row would release Slave to the Grind, which would debut at the top spot of the Billboard charts, clearly indicating that the change in decades was not slowing down glam metal whatsoever. Meanwhile, in the land of thrash, they were playing as fast as ever. As the 90s started, Megadeth would find what many, myself included, consider to be their definitive lineup by adding drummer Nick Menza and lead guitarist Marty Friedman. Indeed, their next 2 albums with this combination, 1990's Rust in Peace and 92's Countdown to Extinction, are still considered 2 of their best offerings. Rust in Peace, whose title is a reference to a bumper sticker Mustaine had seen that read, quote, "May all your nuclear weapons rust in peace," features songs that have more rhythm and tempo shifts than earlier Megadeth records. Among these tracks are classics like Holy Wars and Hangar 18, a song featuring alien conspiracy lyrics written by Nick Menza, and the same chord progression and shapes that Mustaine had used back in his days with Metallica that had subsequently been turned into the instrumental track called Cthulhu. Lyrically, the album, as hinted at by its title, would also continue to deal with nuclear warfare. However, it would also deal with another existential threat, global warming, on the track Dawn Patrol. Yep, way back in 1990, a heavy metal band of all things knew this was a problem, and here we are today with the same issue. Now, Rust in Peace was a new level of success for Megadeth, as it would be their first platinum-selling album. They were far from done, however, as it would follow it up with the even more successful Countdown to Extinction, an album which featured a bit of a tweak in their formula, as the songs are now simpler and more radio-friendly than what they had released before, while still staying close to their thrash roots. The album was so popular, in fact, that it went double platinum. Something that Mustaine himself never expected, so much so that he had earlier told bassist Dave Ellefson that if it went double platinum he would go skydiving, never believing that he would have to follow through on such a statement, which actually explains a clip I remember seeing someplace of Mustaine prepping to go skydiving. With these two albums, Dave Mustaine was finally able to create something that could rival his former bandmates. For as much as I will hold up albums like Ride the Lightning and Justice for All and Master of Puppets as some of the greatest thrash metal records period, Rust in Peace and Countdown to Extinction are right up there with them. Meanwhile, in 1990, Slayer would release a highly regarded album of their own, Seasons in the Abyss. With this release, Slayer would unintentionally finish a trilogy of albums much like Metallica's Lightning, Puppets, and Justice that are now seen as the high point in their catalog. Seasons is almost a perfect combination of their previous two albums. Essentially, it was like they combined the speed of fury of Rain and Blood with the dark atmosphere south of heaven to create Seasons in the Abyss. Songs like War Ensemble, Seasons in the Abyss, and Dead Skin Mask would all become mainstays in Slayer's live shows for years to come. Speaking of live shows, Megadeth and Slayer would combine forces in 1990 for the Clash of the Titans tour. For the first leg of the tour through Europe, these two titans of thrash metal were supported by Testament and Suicidal Tendencies. Yet what should have been a triumphant demonstration of how popular their brand of heavy metal had become would instead be marred by drama, as Dave Mustaine managed to tick off most of the other bands on the tour as he ran his mouth in the press. This included taking shots at Suicidal Tendencies vocalist Mike Muir even though the two didn't even know one another. I mean, what better way to start off a relationship with people you're going on the road with for an extended time than by taking shots at them through the media? This behavior would lead Suicidal Tendencies guitarist Mike Clark to later state, quote, "Dave Mustaine is a jerk. I'm not one to put people down and talk behind people's backs, but during that tour he publicly stated in some magazine interviews that we were unprofessional, not good enough, and did not deserve to play the Clash of Titans tour. He said Mike couldn't sing, sings like a frog, something stupid like that." Yet when Mike Sings Like a Frog Muir confronted Mustaine while on tour about his comments, Dave would apparently make a lot of excuses, claiming he had been misquoted and that the press were out to get him. Excuses which Muir did not buy, as they felt way too conspiracy theorist for him, which makes perfect sense coming from Mustaine's mouth. Speaking of which, he also apparently took shots at Slayer guitarist Kerry King, comments which started a decade-long feud between the two bands. Yet, despite this simmering bad blood, they still had the North American leg of the tour left, for which Slayer and Megadeth would be joined by Anthrax, meaning that this tour featured 3/4 of the big four of thrash metal. This tour then was almost like a victory lap for these bands. They had worked hard and done things their own way and now looked to be taking over the music world. That being said, there was something else of note about this tour, as opening for the three thrash metal bands would be a group of young upstarts with only one album to their name. They were a heavy metal band in their own right, but one with a sound that was totally unlike what their tour mates were producing. This band hailed from Seattle, a city that was about to spark its own musical revolution. A band which is another of my personal favorites, Alice in Chains. Now, Alice were on Clash of the Titans kind of by accident. Or to be more precise, they were there due to an accident involving the band Death Angel who were supposed to have been in that opening spot. You see, on the 28th of November 1990, following a show in Mesa, Arizona, Death Angel were heading to their next date when their sound man fell asleep, which may not sound like a huge deal until you realize he was driving the RV they were traveling in at 90 miles per hour down the highway, which you know is not a good thing. As a result, the bus and everyone inside of it went into a ravine and slid for some 300 feet. Now, it does not seem like anyone was killed, but there were some serious injuries. Most notably, Andy Gallion suffered severe head trauma which took him a full year to recover from. This accident meant Death Angel could not appear on the tour, and indeed would more or less cause the band to break up for a decade. Clash of Titans, though, would still carry on, and stepping in to replace Death Angel, who were a thrash band, and thus a natural fit for the tour, were Alice in Chains, who were very much not a thrash band. The crowds then were very much non-responsive to downright hostile, as they refused to accept these upstarts playing a different style of heavy music than everyone else on the tour. The young men out of Seattle, in fact, were reportedly constantly pelted by all manner of filth and refuse. This, however, did not stop Alice in Chains, as despite this abuse they kept on playing defiantly, refusing to give up the stage until their time was up. Indeed, Lane Staley at times even gave it back, as he jumped into the audience and started throwing punches. The newcomers' unbreakable defiance and determination in the face of such hostile crowds earned the respect of the other bands on the tour, if nothing else. Yet, while on this tour Alice in Chains were the young upstart unknowns playing in someone else's playground, they wouldn't be for long, as soon the scene they were a part of back in Seattle would come to dominate the American music scene itself. Grunge was a strange moment in music history. Despite being treated as a kind of overarching musical movement, the reality was the bands bearing that label sonically didn't really have that much in common. They were lumped together basically because they all came out of the same area, primarily Seattle, at about the same time. Now, they were a close-knit group to some extent, but that doesn't mean their music had that much in common. Nirvana owed much of their sound to punk and alternative rock, while Pearl Jam is, I guess, more of a straight-up rock band. Other than their geography, then, at most what they had in common was a distaste for the corporate sound of the 80s music in general. In fact, most of the bands that were put under the grunge label were not what you would call metal. Two bands, though, in my opinion, could be considered heavy metal: Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. Now, while grunge burst onto the national stage in the 90s, the Seattle rock scene dated back at least to the 60s, with groups like the Sonics and the Wailers. The Wailers specifically are notable because they played in a club called the Spanish Castle, and in doing so, helped to inspire a young Jimi Hendrix while he was still living in the city. Seattle would also give birth to the 70s rock band Heart, headed by the Wilson sisters. The city in general then just tended to be the home of a number of musicians. Illustrator Ed Fotheringham, who attended the University of Washington School of Arts in Seattle, would claim this was because, quote, "It rains a lot in Seattle. People played loud guitars in their basements, and when they were old enough, they played shows." In other words, Seattle's infamously damp climate meant that people had to find activities indoors to occupy their time, and a number of young people especially embraced music, thereby providing a fertile crop of young musicians. Come the early 80s, the music scene in Seattle would start to shift from predominantly cover bands to a real underground punk scene that was heavily inspired by hardcore bands like Black Flag and DOA. Now, initially, punks are outsiders who would be beat up for being different, I guess. According to Duff McKagan, who I had not known was a big part of this scene in Seattle before eventually joining Guns N' Roses, quote, "Punk rock was a refuge for people that didn't fit in at school or on sports teams. Punk rockers were the guys getting beat up by the jocks." Yet it doesn't seem to have taken that long for punk to start becoming popular in Seattle, to the point that the people who used to beat up the punks were now attending their shows. The punk scene in the city from that point on then, at least according to Mark Arm of Green River and Mudhoney, became pretty open and inviting. Among the groups who were a part of this scene was a band called the U-Men, who were active throughout the 1980s. The U-Men were this kind of punk or punk-adjacent band that would serve as an inspiration for a lot of young Seattle area musicians. Notably, round about the same time in the early 80s, Seattle also saw a bit of a revival of 60s-era music, as groups performing in clubs downtown started playing classic songs from that era, just with more of a modern, harder edge. Meanwhile, on the heavier side of things, as heavy metal was on the rise in the US, Queensryche would emerge out of Seattle. Their success then provided local bands with even more inspiration that they too one day might make it big. Queensryche weren't alone either, as Metal Church and the crossover band The Accused, who were a mixture of thrash and punk, would also come out of the region during that time as well. Indeed, as the years went by, there seems to have been more and more crossover between the various strains of punk and heavy metal. As where in other locales, these scenes did not coexist on friendly terms. In Seattle, there does seem to have been at least a bit more freedom when it came to listening to a myriad of styles. This intermixing of different subcultures and styles would be crucial in forming the backbone of the Seattle scene that would rise to national and global prominence in the 90s. This intermixing of styles, according to Tom Hazelmeyer of Halo of Flies and Amphetamine Records, was also a byproduct of the abnormally large number of record stores in the city. Seattle, for whatever reason, just seemed to have more really good, well-stocked record stores than one would expect to find in a city of its size. It's Hazelmeyer's belief, then, that these stores were just as vital, if not even more so, than the city's various clubs because they served as a meeting place for many of Seattle's young music fans, as these stores were a home for anyone who was looking for something outside of what the standard shop in a mall would stock. It was seemingly only a matter of time then before these young musicians had the idea to see what it sounded like when they started smashing all their inspirations together. One of the first bands in the region to attempt this Reese's Peanut Butter Cups approach to music was called Green River. The group consisted of vocalist Mark Arm, drummer Alex Vincent, bassist Jeff Ament, and guitarist Steve Turner and Stone Gassard, with each member bringing with them their own eclectic set of influences that they essentially threw into a pot together to see what came out. There were various punk influences, 60s era garage type stuff, alternative stuff like The Replacements, some post-punk stuff like the Meat Puppets that were combined with bands like Kiss and even new wave British heavy metalers Venom. Now, this wasn't necessarily a two great tastes taste great together scenario, as according to guitarist Dave Detter, whose band The Presidents of the United States of America also formed in Seattle, Green River wasn't actually all that great. They would, however, provide the inspiration for other bands to blend their influences together, and so while Green River themselves wouldn't crack the code, later groups like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden would. And after listening to some of their stuff, I can hear where Detterer is coming from. Green River feels a little like they're wearing their influences a bit too much on their sleeves. Yet even with that, you can hear how they might have been a bigger deal had other bands not come along and done it better. Yet while Green River would provide a kind of blueprint for later so-called grunge bands, that particular group would not benefit from the scene's eventual success, as the group would split in part due to their different influences, as members like bassist Jeff Ament wanted to go down a more acceptable commercial rock-type path, while Mark Arm wanted to fully reject that and go into a more punk/Iggy Pop-type direction. Unable to resolve these differences, the band would split, but out of Green River's ashes would form groups like Mudhoney, Mother Love Bone, and eventually Pearl Jam. Now, while Green River would prove to be very influential on the Seattle music scene, another band that formed a year earlier in 1983 in Aberdeen, Washington, would prove to be just as critical. The Melvins were formed when vocalist and guitarist Buzz Osborne joined forces with bassist Matt Lukin and drummer Dale Crover. Initially, they were described as a very fast hardcore punk band. Gradually, though, they started playing slower, as they were inspired by Black Sabbath in particular. This is notable because Sabbath at the time, at least among their community and age group, were not seen as being cool. They were probably looked at as this old-timey out-of-touch band from the previous decade. The Melvins then made it cool to like Black Sabbath again, as they took what Sabbath had done and essentially added a new punk edge to them. In doing so, the Melvins were notably following a bit in the footsteps of another of their major influences, the hardcore punk band Black Flag, as the second half of their My War album had this heavy, ponderous pace that was itself very much inspired by Black Sabbath. Now, this dramatic shift from their normal rapid-fire hardcore punk approach took a lot of Black Flag fans by surprise. Yet, where others were upset, Buzz was inspired. The Melvins then very much helped to establish the general blueprint for the so-called grunge bands, as while they listened to a lot of hardcore punk bands like Black Flag, they also listened to a lot of the classic rock bands their punk heroes had been rebelling against. As they started combining their punk influences with a heavy dose of Black Sabbath, the Melvin sound would begin evolving into something unique or at the very least significantly different than what was typically being produced at the time. They were taking punk that was traditionally played fast and made it into this slow, heavy, plodding monster. Meanwhile, as they were slowing down, Osborne also changed his guitar tone to something dirtier and muddier. In doing so, they became effectively the heaviest band around, and one of the most influential as numerous young musicians in the region embraced their sound. Among those influenced by the Melvins was Kim Thayil of Soundgarden. According to Thayil himself, he had ditched bands like Sabbath, Zeppelin, Kiss, and Aerosmith when he started getting into punk, because he saw them as all being part and parcel with the music industry, and as a result, they represented everything that the punk bands he'd fallen in love with were rebelling against. Yet, when he saw these still very punk-inspired Melvins reaching back and taking inspiration from bands like Sabbath, his mind was opened up to such possibilities. In addition to taking inspiration from the general sound of the Melvins, many of the other young musicians in the area also latched onto one of their techniques, as their drop D tuning would become popular among many of the other Seattle-based bands. Now, for the non-guitarist out there listening, a guitar is usually tuned from top to bottom EAD GBE. With drop D, then you lower that first D down a full step to D. This allows for two basic things. For one, power chords can be played with just one finger, which allows for a different way of putting riffs together, and it also allows for you to play some lower notes and chords without detuning your whole guitar. The Melvins then were defined by being slow, down-tuned, and heavy, meaning they were starkly different than what was generally popular at the time in the 80s. Now, while the Melvins never really got the fame of their later counterparts, they would serve as the leading lights of a new musical movement, as numerous other bands in the region would hear what they were doing and put their own spin on it. In other words, while the glam bands were competing over their image and who were the biggest partiers, and the thrash bands were competing over who could play the fastest, the Seattle bands went back to the originators of the genre, Black Sabbath, and saw who could play slower and heavier, meaning they were distinctly different from what was playing on the radio and on MTV. They weren't glam, but they weren't thrash either. One of the earliest of these bands who would take these lessons and build upon them formed in 1984. This band would team up former drummer and singer Chris Cornell's dynamic vocal range and Kim Thayil's Black Sabbath-inspired riffs. Indeed, Thayil has described the band as being Black Sabbath-influenced punk, as he was also heavily inspired by the likes of The Birthday Party, Killing Joke, Wire, Joy Division, Meat Puppets, Black Flag, and Minor Threat. Notably though, despite comparisons being made between the two bands, they were not inspired by Led Zeppelin. Indeed, Thayil has said he did not like Zeppelin at all. After a few lineup changes, which included the departure of founding bassist Hiro Yamamoto, the band would eventually find their definitive lineup when they eventually were joined by drummer Matt Cameron and later by Ben Shepherd on bass. This new band would call themselves Soundgarden, taking their name from a pipe sculpture in Seattle Sandpoint that would produce an unearthly howling noise in the wind, a seemingly fitting moniker. 2 years later, in 1986, Soundgarden would get their first break, when they were featured alongside the Melvins on local independent record label CZ Records' Deep Six compilation. The Seattle sound then was well on its way to being established at this point. Soundgarden would follow this up in 1987 when they released the Screaming Life EP for local label Sub Pop, while that same year the Melvins also released their album Gluey Porch Treatments. This notably is about the same time that the term grunge would first start appearing in the marketing of the aforementioned independent label Sub Pop when describing the sound that was emanating from the Seattle area. Now, Sub Pop, before it was a local independent record label, had actually started out as a magazine run by Bruce Pavitt. Bruce operated a local record store called the Bomb Shelter and created the magazine to help shine a light on the Seattle music scene he was so excited by. Also in love with the burgeoning music scene in town was radio DJ Jonathan Poneman, who hosted a show called Audio Oasis that only played local bands. Additionally, Poneman also worked as a promoter, helping local groups find places to play. Now, neither man really knew the other, but due to their passion for the local music scene, both would have the same idea. They wanted to put out a Soundgarden record. This was likely an exciting experience for Soundgarden, as it's not every day you have two competing offers to put out a record for you. It wasn't exactly an easy choice either, as according to Kim Thayil, each had their own strong points. You see, John had financial resources to back his offer up with, while Bruce had connections to magazines and record labels. Each then had their benefits, so instead of choosing, the guitarist suggested the two men team up, thereby giving Soundgarden a more complete package. So, Sub Pop, the independent label, was formed, a label which would focus on doing EPs at first, as they were cheaper to make and so they could sell them for less, which they figured would make it so people were more likely to take a chance on a more unknown product. Now, while that seems like a fairly reasonable decision, those were apparently few and far between in Sub Pop, as from all accounts it seems to have been a terribly run company. They wasted money left and right while still often failing to pay people for their work. Sub Pop then was primarily only able to carry on as long as they did and get the kind of recognizable profile that they had, not because of their own business acumen, but because of the music these Seattle bands were creating and the underground excitement it generated. Now, what was happening in Seattle and the buzz they were creating was only possible because of the network of college radio stations, fanzines, and indie distributors that had sprung up in the wake of the punk rock movement. Regional scenes, you see, were now viable thanks to punk and the self-supporting network that had been created around it. This was crucial because in Seattle, live music wasn't a big thing, thanks to the city's repressive liquor laws and its infamous teen dance ordinance that threatened to shut down any concert with teens in the audience. Recording in the mid-80s, though, was cheap, and local radio stations like KCMU, WFMU, KRAB, and KJET happily supported local bands. Specifically, stations like KCMU and WFMU were listener-powered, and were thus encouraged to play local bands. These stations then were deeply connected to the scene. Indeed, Bruce Pavitt, one of the founders of Sub Pop, Kim Thile of Soundgarden, and Mark Arm of Green River and Mudhoney would all work at KCMU at one point or another. The Seattle scene also thrived in no small part due to how supportive the various bands and musicians were of one another. Mark Pickerel, the original drummer of Screaming Trees, would note the contrast in Seattle to the highly competitive scene they'd come from in Ellensburg, quote, "We were surprised to be warmly accepted by not just the audience in the Northwest, but by the bands themselves. It seemed like the bands worked closely together to make things work for each other, to serve a common goal." Meanwhile, Jerry Cantrell would describe the relationship between the various Seattle area bands as a, quote, "very supportive type thing, without being a real blowing smoke up your ass/ass-kissing fest," all of which effectively helped to create a tight-knit network of musicians who, free of major label meddling, just made music to please their friends. Now, as far as the whole flannel aesthetic went, it's not like it was a conscious choice by everyone to dress alike. Flannel was simply cheap and durable, and at most a rejection of the flashy glam metal aesthetic of the 80s. Indeed, the look and attitude of the Seattle scene was essentially in many ways a rejection of the greed is good philosophy that permeated that decade. It wasn't quite the anti-fashion of punk, as it was more a rejection of fashion in general, by which I mean they weren't necessarily looking to make a statement like the punk aesthetic did. Really, it wasn't about making a statement. The look was simply utilitarian, but in a way that in and of itself made a statement. With that in mind, you can view the grunge movement almost as a rejection of the yuppies and extreme materialism of the 80s. Yuppies are young urban professionals, according to a Newsweek cover story, were men and women aged 25 to 39, members of the baby boomer generation, earning $40,000 or more in professional or managerial positions. More so than that, though, one of the main criteria for identifying a yuppie was they were individuals whose lives were focused on, quote, aspirations of glory, prestige, recognition, fame, social status, power, money, or any and all combination of the above. The yuppies then purchased and looked at products and services as status symbols. The things they owned were important to their sense of self in a way, all of which was part of a shift toward greater materialism and more conspicuous consumption, as illustrated in a 1984 Washington Post article titled, quote,
Yuppies are different. They are what they own.
According to this article, chow was the classic yuppie greeting, and real estate and food were their favorite topics of conversation. Speaking of food, they wouldn't eat red meat, yet they would enjoy squid, conch, and shark fins. These were people who wore Rolexes and hired housekeepers, nannies, doormen, jacuzzi repairmen, and pet trainers. They were also described as closet Republicans who were likely to vote for Ronald Reagan in the next election. Television was notably not immune to this new extreme materialism. If anything, it fed into it and fueled it to even greater heights. To illustrate this, you only have to look at the type of characters portrayed on primetime television. You see, in the 60s, primetime shows had featured minorities and lower-class characters, but by the 80s, that trend had been almost abandoned. Instead, it seemed that everyone on TV was at least well-off, if not downright wealthy. The characters featured were oftentimes millionaires living largely selfish lifestyles. Shows like Dallas and Dynasty were both extremely popular and are a perfect example of this trend, but so was the more reality-based lifestyles of the rich and famous. The philosophy of the 80s then very much seemed to be that greed was good. You were encouraged to be selfish and look out only for yourself, so you too could get rich and be like the people you saw on TV. The thing was, though, this was not a sentiment that really seemed to be shared by the city of Seattle, a city that at that time was just shedding its hippie image while still holding on to the hippie values of counterculture and nonconformity. What drove the music scene there then was not just a reaction and rejection of the overproduced corporate music of the day, but also the political climate of the time. As, like I mentioned in the last episode, Reagan and the conservatives were in firm control in the 80s, and that sparked a whole new series of culture wars. In this conservative climate, people who smoked weed, and especially people of color, were targets of the war on drugs. Gay people were punchlines, and the AIDS epidemic was something to be literally laughed at by those in power. Greater censorship of art, film, and music were fought for and to some extent achieved, with the PMRC being a great example of this trend. The 80s were also the last days of the Cold War, as conservatives pumped up the military budget and the military-industrial complex, doing so thanks to the fear they preached of nuclear holocaust and communists. Conformity then was the order of the day. Stuff like long hair, earrings, and skateboarding were signs of deviancy. Yet, despite this, a counterculture grew in certain parts of the country, and Seattle was one of them. What really made the Seattle scene different then is they were heavily influenced by the same ethos that drove the punk scene of the 70s. Be different. For example, as the punk and metal bands of the 80s looked to play faster and faster, the Seattle bands, thanks to the influence of the Melvins, found their heaviness by playing slower and being different than the mainstream. Their songs took on heavier grooves and their guitars got detuned as the riffs became bigger and longer. At the same time, they weren't limited to the conventions of a single musical genre. Instead, they felt free to combine musical styles. This Be Different attitude extended to the overall culture of the scene as well, as there was this very much communal sense among these bands that was different from the selfish get-rich-no-matter-who-you-heard on the way there philosophy of the 80s. Time and again you see as they were coming up together, these bands would interact and help one another out. They were inspired by what the other bands were doing, but it didn't become a jealous, destructive thing. They just created. And in contrast to the predominant self-indulgent hair metal style of the 80s, the subject matter of the music coming out of Seattle oftentimes dealt with a social awareness and the desire to be heard and accepted, a message that reverberated with people. Meanwhile, as the 80s were coming to an end, the 90s were starting with a wave of negativity. You see, as the new decade dawned, America was not only entering a recession, but would also soon start the first Gulf War. With that as the background, listeners across the country grew tired of the 80s party rock music and wanted to hear something that resonated with their own lives. The music coming out of Seattle then would for many provide the soundtrack for this period in time. In 1988, an important moment happened in the development of the Seattle scene, as Soundgarden became the first of this generation of bands to sign a deal with a major label. Up until now, the whole Seattle scene had been very underground and anti-establishment, as they made and released music through small independent labels. Indeed, Soundgarden themselves had released 2 EPs through Sub Pop before the major labels came calling. When they did, however, there was apparently a bit of a bidding war between multiple labels. Yet Soundgarden would decide to go with A&M because they had a reputation of hiring people who were actual music fans and thus were actually supportive of young bands. Basically, A&M had a reputation as being more artist-friendly than other labels. Yet, even as they were in active discussions with A&M, Soundgarden would release Ultra Mega OK on indie label SST. This understandably took A&M by surprise, but the band's reasoning was they knew this process took a while. Negotiations could last for months, after which they would have to record an album that the label would likely sit on for a couple months before releasing it, meaning that there would potentially be a span of a year or so where the band wouldn't produce anything new, which was not something the members of Soundgarden were interested in. They wanted to keep building their momentum, not bring it to a screeching halt for a year. Ultimately, this wouldn't be a deal breaker, as Soundgarden would sign and release a new album through A&M titled Louder Than Love. This was a big deal, although there were some in the Seattle scene who saw one of their own signing with a major label as a betrayal. They feared Soundgarden were going corporate, however, true to the ethic of the movement, they would bring others along with them. Indeed, the very next band to sign with a major label got the opportunity thanks in no small part to Soundgarden, this band being none other than our other major focus in the scene, Alice in Chains, a group that had first formed in 1987. Now, unlike a lot of the other so-called grunge bands, Alice in Chains didn't have a lot of punk influence in their music. Instead, both singer Lane Staley and guitarist Jerry Cantrell had played in metal bands before coming together to form Alice in Chains. Lane, for example, had been in a hair metal band named Sleaze who changed their name to Alice in Chains like Guns N' Roses in 1986. About a year after this, Staley would meet Cantrell at a party, at which point the pair hit it off almost instantly. Both loved music and both had issues with their parents. Lane, for example, had been kicked out of his mother's house while Jerry was living on his own. Cantrell hadn't grown up with much. In fact, he didn't even start playing guitar until he was 17 because he could never afford one before that. In fact, it sounds like he quote-unquote borrowed his cousin's cheap Mustang copy and weird little stereo system that let you record onto 8-track tapes one day, and the rest was essentially history. Part of the reason why Jerry didn't have much growing up was due to his parents' divorce. He ended up being raised by his mother and his grandmother, and as a result wasn't really close with his father. However, not long before meeting Lane, both Jerry's mother and grandmother died within 6 months of one another, leaving him on his own with no home. Jerry then had used what little money he got from his mother's life insurance policy to purchase some gear, with which he put together a band called Diamond Lie that became for a time the biggest band in Tacoma. After learning of Cantrell's situation, Lane offered to help him out by setting him up at the music bank like he was. The music bank, you see, was this warehouse in Ballard that rented out rooms for bands to play in. Lane had a job overseeing the property, was also living out of a space there, and he figured Jerry could get the same deal that he did. So the two became friends before Cantrell ever heard Lane sing, but when he did, he realized he had to be in a band with this guy. As luck would have it, it wasn't long after they first met up that within a short period of time, Staley's Alice in Chains and Cantrell's Diamond Lie would both break up. Jerry would then start auditioning musicians for a new band, finding both Sean Kinney and bassist Mike Starr in the process. Jerry obviously wanted Lane, but he had joined a different band already. So Cantrell and the others cooked up a plan to convince Lane to join them. Basically, the plan was they would hold auditions for singers in the music bank while Lane was manning the front desk. The thing was, they weren't actually looking to try out good singers. Instead, they were bringing in the worst guys imaginable and pretending they were seriously considering them. This kept up until finally Lane couldn't take it anymore, and after one guy came through, he announced that they could not let a guy that bad be in their band, and finally agreed to join them. And when he did, they would officially adopt the slightly altered name of Lane's old group, calling themselves Alice in Chains. Now, they did not immediately become the Alice in Chains we know today. Instead, they were, if anything, initially more of a glam band. That being said, they didn't really seem to take themselves all that seriously, as can be seen in their song Queen of the Rodeo, which appears to purposely be poking fun at the scene. So when news got around about Soundgarden getting signed, which seemed to portend a shift in the music industry, they were seemingly more than ready to drop the whole glam shtick and head in a new direction. After all, even before this, a number of their friends were reportedly giving them shit for the whole glam thing, telling them that they were better than all of that. That being said, this sudden shift caused them in some circles to be seen as posers, who were just copying what Soundgarden had started, which Cantrell has admitted to doing to some extent. Yet in doing so, saying that such behavior is normal, as you emulate those that inspire you until you find your own identity. Which they did, as I think it's fairly safe to argue that Alice in Chains ultimately created a sound that was uniquely their own and distinct from the other Seattle area bands. They would combine the heavy metal aspects of bands like Black Sabbath with lead singer Lane Staley's and guitarist Jerry Cantrell's abilities to create unique vocal harmonies. In doing so, they crafted a sound that, while somewhat familiar, was also uniquely their own. They created music that was heavy, dark, and brooding, and which perfectly paired with Lane's vocals, which have been described as achingly soulful and sinister. I mean, I've heard his sound described as the voice of doom, and it's a very fitting description. In addition to his unique voice, the lyrics both he and Cantrell penned emphasized serious issues like depression, drugs, and loneliness as they focused on the harsh realities of life. Now, this did not happen in a vacuum, as it would also receive some tips from fellow Seattle band Soundgarden. You see, after hearing Beyond the Wheel, Cantrell would ask Kim Thile how he played it, and Kim would share with him the knowledge of drop D tuning that he probably had picked up from the Melvins, a tuning that Cantrell would use throughout his career. Now, that wasn't the only time Soundgarden would help out Alice in Chains either, as shortly after Soundgarden signed their deal with A&M, Soundgarden's management team of Kelly Curtis and Susan Silvers were offered the chance to manage the band. You see, one half of their former management team got busted, likely because he was a part-time coke dealer, so they needed new representation. While Susan Silver, who was Chris Cornell's girlfriend at the time, was a big fan of the band. She thought they were great guys and extremely funny and had already been helping them out around town here and there, so she took them on. She was especially impressed by a demo tape they had made and was circulating around, a tape she and Kelly would pass along to Columbia Records, who would sign the band in '89. 1989 was also the same year that another band would release their debut album Bleach on local independent label Sub Pop. Yet, even though Nirvana were fairly new on the scene, they would arguably have the biggest impact out of all the Seattle bands, as despite not being the first band to get a major label deal, they would prove to be the band that broke open the floodgates for mainstream recognition. That being said, one can still very clearly trace the origins of Nirvana's extreme success to one of the more lesser-known bands to come out of Seattle. Seeing as how, even though Nirvana's sound owed itself more to punk and alternative rock than anything else, they were also very much inspired by the Melvins and their sound, but their connections did not stop there. You see, even though Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic had gone to high school together, they would not become friends until afterwards while hanging out at the Melvins' rehearsal space. Cobain was a huge fan of the Melvins to the extent that he would show up at most of their shows that Novoselic was also in attendance for, partially because he was a fan, but mainly because he was working for them as a roadie. The two then started hanging out, which eventually led to making music together. The one problem was they never really could seem to find a decent drummer to work with. This was such an issue that when they went to record their demo, the Melvins drummer Dale Crover would help them out, which is another example of how the members of this scene were seemingly more interested in assisting one another than competing. Yet there was only so much that Crover could do, seeing as how he was already in a band, which meant when they played live, Kurt and Chris often had to rely on a drummer who couldn't keep time. This really didn't help, and nor did the fact that early on, Kurt really had not figured out how to play and sing at the same time. That being said, the group would improve rapidly, making what many describe as tremendous strides in a short amount of time. Some of this was a result of Kurt getting over his initial nervousness from playing in front of people, as he went from standing stiff as a board with his hair covering his eyes to jumping all over the place like a madman. They also got better at crafting their songs, which went a long way to making them sound better. A big part of their growth, though, was credited to the addition of drummer Chad Channing, who was the first real drummer they actually got to play with live. Actually having someone who was at least competent backing them up went a long way to improving the band's sound. However, the position wouldn't be truly filled until 1990 when Buzz Osborne and the Melvins helped to hook them up with Dave Grohl. Meanwhile, also in 1990, Alice in Chains would release their major label debut, Facelift. The album that would help to land them a spot on the tour with the Monsters of Thrash Metal wasted no time telling its listeners this was something different than a normal fare heard on the radio at the time. It wasn't hair metal, yet at the same time, the song that was inspired by Cantrell seeing a bunch of 9 to 11-year-olds with beepers selling drugs on the street, and which was powered by a driving drop D riff, wasn't thrash metal either. Indeed, none of the tracks on the album really fit in with any established genre at the time. Not Bleed the Freak, which speaks to being an outcast, nor the dark emotional Love Hate Love, which features particularly impressive vocal work by Lane Staley. Even its breakout hit Man in the Box didn't really fit into any established category. Instead, it was this heavy, almost bluesy throwback song that was actually about censorship, yet is constantly censored whenever it plays on the radio, and I'm not sure if that's ironic or not. Regardless, in 1991, Soundgarden would release their third album, Bad Motorfinger, which I will do a full Sound Stories episode on next month. In brief, the songs on the album ranged from heavy to surreal and hypnotic. They would feature odd time signatures and unusual guitar tunings that were further set off by Cornell's dynamic vocal range. It's a strange, unusual album in a lot of ways, and one that really did not in any way fit into the established trends in the music industry, yet still it would break into the top 40 and would go platinum. Although this success would pale in comparison to the album that released just 2 weeks later, Nirvana's first album for Geffen Records. Now, calling Nevermind a major success is almost an understatement, as it would go on to sell 7 million copies in the US alone. This was huge, and it came essentially out of nowhere, as you can almost trace all these sales back to one song. Smells Like Teen Spirit, though, was not only a breakout hit for Nirvana, but for the entire Seattle scene as well. It was more than just the song itself, as the most powerful driver of this success was its video that played 4 to 5 times a day on MTV for weeks on end. Really, it was this as much as anything else that would spell the end of glam metal. Sure, to some extent, people were getting tired of the same old bands. The market was oversaturated at this point with cookie-cutter acts. For example, guitarist George Lynch of Dokken would compare the 80s glam metal bands to sheep, saying that, quote, "Everyone just chased each other's tail until it exploded in on itself. Grunge exposed it for the silliness that it was." Plus, there was also this new generation of music fans coming up who were ready to embrace the more serious sound and subject matter of the Seattle scene. Indeed, none other than J.J. French and Twisted Sister would say that, quote, "Hair bands fell apart because kids were dying for something real. They got sick of the pretentiousness of the 'let's party on' dudes, vacuous music garbage that was coming out of the 80s. So when Nirvana and Pearl Jam hit, it was a dose of real emotion. The songs are better, the message is more real." That being said, before this moment, those hair bands had still been selling tons of albums. Really, then as much as anything else, the pivotal shift came when MTV changed allegiances. As I established last time, MTV had been a major player in the popularity of the glam metal scene. Their medium was a perfect fit for those image-conscious bands. But once MTV started to embrace the anti-image, anti-fashion grunge movement, glam metal really didn't have a home anymore. They had lost their biggest ally and would just kind of wither on the vine. This explosion of attention on the Seattle scene brought on by Nirvana's success would mean that all the bands from the region would be hit with the grunge label. Even bands that had previously been marketed as metal, like Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, would now be labeled as grunge. In the midst of this wave, Alice in Chains would in 1992 release their second album, Dirt. The dark and gloomy album would make their career, as it went platinum by the end of the year. Dirt was an altogether darker record than Facelift had been. In many ways, though, it also marked the true starting point for Alice in Chains and especially Lane's descent into hell. As I argue more completely in my Sound Stories episode on this album, following the initial half of the LP, which includes the thunderous drop D riffing of Them Bones and Damn the River, the slower Rain When I Die, the haunting dark love song Down in a Hole, and a song dedicated to Jerry Vietnam's vet father, the album then pretty much completely focuses on the descent of a heroin junkie. Starting with Junkhead, where the person is still having fun, over the next several songs, his addiction gradually takes more and more control, making his life a living hell. Angry Chair then is about rehab and attempting to get clean, and then you reach the final song of the album, Wood, which was written in response to the lead singer Mother Love Bone Andrew Wood's death of a heroin overdose after his own attempts to get clean, making it overall a sad, dark, and tragic album. Meanwhile, Soundgarden, who had been the first Seattle band out of the gate, had started to trail behind the others in terms of success. They had by this point been leapfrogged by Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains, but in '94 Soundgarden would finally hit it big with Super Unknown. The album would spawn a total of 5 singles, including the frantic Spoon Man, the mid-tempo Fell on Black Days that seems to deal with depression, and most famously the twisted ballad Black Hole Sun. The album also features slow, plodding, heavily detuned songs like Mailman and 4th of July. Super Unknown then was a massive hit, as it debuted at number 1 and would go double platinum by the end of the year. Soundgarden would also win their very first MTV Video Music Award for Best Heavy Metal/Hard Rock Video for Black Hole Sun, further cementing the conquest of MTV by the Seattle bands. Unfortunately, the so-called grunge bands would not have a happy ending. Just like their music, their fate seemed tied to tragedy. On April 8, 1994, Kurt Cobain would be found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Then, almost exactly 8 years later on April 19, 2002, Lane Staley would be found dead from an overdose of heroin and other drugs. Then, 15 years after that, on the 18th of May 2017, Chris Cornell would commit suicide in his hotel room following a show with a reunited Soundgarden. While yet another of the tremendous vocalists who came out of that scene, Mark Lanigan of the Screaming Trees, Mad Season, and Queens of the Stone Age, would die on the 22nd of February 2022. He was just 57 years old. The tragic thing at the heart of the grunge scene and its success was that it almost seems as if none of them really wanted all of that fame and attention. Coming out of Seattle, it seems the thing they most wanted was to make music. The popularity and the big record deals made that possible, but everything that came along with that was seemingly too much for them to handle. Kurt would commit suicide and Lane and others would fall into drug abuse. Even Pearl Jam, who are still going on strong, would attempt to pull away from the attention. As for a time, they stopped making videos and giving interviews in an attempt to slow the madness down. Like I said though, some of the groups still soldier on. Pearl Jam continues to tour and release albums, and even Alice in Chains, after years of inactivity due to Lane's addiction and eventual death, would reunite with a new singer, William Duvall, giving their career an unexpected second act that continues on to this day. While the Seattle bands were putting metal in the mainstream, something else was happening down by Arlington, Texas. It all started with one Jerry Abbott, a country and blues producer who owned his own studio in Pantego. It was through his expertise that his two sons, Vinnie Paul and Daryl, would navigate the treacherous waters of the music industry. Long before that, however, their musical journey seemed to have started when Vinnie came home from school one day with a tuba, to which his father Jerry said something along the lines of, quote, "Son, take that thing back. Play the drums or do something that's going to make you some cash." Taking his father's advice, the young Vinnie started playing the drums, as did his younger brother Daryl, who was eager to follow in his footsteps. However, when Vinnie proved to be the better drummer, Daryl would ask their father for a guitar instead. For a while, though, young Daryl didn't so much play his guitar as use it as a prop for when he dressed up like Ace Frehley of Kiss. As such, he seemed to be in no rush to actually learn how to play. Yet, once he did make that decision, Daryl apparently learned incredibly quickly. Doing so without taking formal lessons. Daryl tried taking guitar lessons once but never went back, as he preferred to figure things out on his own. Part of this process included taking advantage of his father's studio, where he got to watch and listen to a bunch of great Texas blues players. According to Daryl, quote, "My dad showed me some scales, musicians in his studio would show me the hot lick of the day, then I'd go home and turn it into my own thing. I'd try to play something and make a mistake, and hear some other note come into play. Then I'd start moving it around and find the beauty of it." It was through this process that Daryl taught himself. Indeed, the story goes he just really woodshedded for about 6 months when he was 16, and came out of that experience extremely skilled, to the point he was winning Guitar Store contests easily. So much so that after the first couple of times where he won himself some really nice gear, Daryl was banned from entering and was asked to judge them instead. The two highly skilled brothers then formed Pantera with bassist Rex Brown and singer Terry Glaze. The group, who were managed by the brothers' father Jerry Abbott, would play in locales around Texas, oftentimes behind chicken wire, like seen in the Blues Brothers. This would net them about $150 a week that they turned around and put into gear. Meanwhile, in addition to getting the band of youngsters booked, Jerry was also credited in helping to hone their songwriting technique. This would lead to the creation of their first album, Metal Magic, in 1983. Now, at this point, they were basically just kids, and didn't really sound anything like what they would become, as they were more or less a kind of glam metal band at this point. That would obviously change in time, but their shift in style seems to have been a natural one. You see, in the beginning, they were huge into groups like ZZ Top, Ozzy, Kiss, and Van Halen, so they tended to sound like those bands. Plus, they at this point hadn't really been exposed to thrash yet, as this was '83 after all, and that scene was just getting started. Eventually, though, they would hear and be influenced by groups like Anthrax, Metallica, and Slayer. Yet before they really shifted gears, Pantera would record and release 3 albums with Terry Glaze in that more commercial glam style from 1983 to '85. That being said, these albums were still quite diverse, which was not necessarily a good thing, as Jerry Abbott would be told by a representative from Mechanic Records. The representative was interested in the band, but he would tell Jerry, quote, "They're too diverse. You get one song that's speed metal, one song that's classic metal, and one that's almost commercial pop. Get your band to hone what they're doing." Basically telling him they needed to pick a direction and stick to it. Advice they would eventually take to heart, but Pantera wouldn't really start to hone in on the sound that would make them famous until vocalist Phil Anselmo joined them in 1987. You see, Terry left the band 2 years earlier because he realized there was no way he was ever going to have a serious say in the band or its direction because the Abbott brothers and their father always voted together, so they always had 3 votes and could thus always dictate the direction of the band. Now, Terry's departure did not really help the band hone their sound. If anything, it sent them adrift a bit, as they would have 4 different singers before they eventually found Anselmo. Phil was just 16 years old at the time he hooked up with Pantera, but by that point he had already quit school, left home, and was gigging 4 to 6 times a week, which is how they eventually heard about him. So Phil flew in from New Orleans, and during his tryout, he and the rest of the band just kinda jammed playing Judas Priest and Iron Maiden songs throughout the night. Things seemed to be going well, but before Phil would agree to join, he wanted to hear what they were working on, as even at this point, while he was still okay with the overall glam aesthetic, he still wanted to make sure they were heading in a heavier direction, which, based upon the demos of power metal they played for him, they definitely were. You see, the band too had decided they wanted to get heavier. Now, to be clear, this wasn't what they would become, and it still wasn't terribly unique from what was going on at the time. Still, it seems like they were starting to hone in on a direction. Now, like I said, Phil was just as guilty as the rest of the band in following along with the glam trend of getting dressed up in leather print spandex, pink scarves, wearing mascara, and feathering their hair. The thing was, Phil in particular was a huge fan of thrash metal and hardcore punk, so for him, dressing up to copy the big hair metal bands really felt fake. It just wasn't who he was, and the breaking point, according to Phil, came in Houston in 1988, as it was there that for whatever reason Anselmo declared that he was not going to do another show in spandex, and if the others had a problem with it, as they had the controlling votes in the band, well, he was ready to quit. This reportedly led to a huge fight, but once the point was proven when they actually were able to have a successful show without playing dress-up, it gave the band a new confidence. Plus, it also gave them a new audience, as according to Phil, the punk kids who never would have gone to see a glam metal act started appearing at their shows now that they were just wearing their street clothes. It was at this point then that they also dropped their 80s glam names, as Rex Rocker Brown just became Rex, and Diamond Daryl instead became Dimebag Daryl. Along with the new look also came an even more aggressive sound. Now, there has been some disagreement over the years over who exactly was responsible for this shift. The Abbotts, for example, insisted that it was them and their vision, seeing as how they were the ones who were actually coming up with the heavier guitar and drum parts. Phil, however, would take credit for being the one who, in his words, showed them the path. Although he would admit it's not like he forced them to do it, he just introduced them to this new approach. And honestly, as is so often the case in such situations, the truth is likely somewhere in the middle and they all had a hand in it. After all, even before Phil joined the band, they were starting to write heavier riffs. Indeed, the Abbotts by that point already had some connections to the world of thrash metal, as they had met and hung out with Metallica, and Daryl had even been offered the chance to join Megadeth, an opportunity he turned down since Mustaine had just hired Nick Menza to be his new drummer, and Dime would not go anywhere without Vinny. Phil, though, does seem to have turned them on to the even heavier Slayer. In fact, he even befriended Kerry King, who would come and hang out with them and even played a gig with the band over one weekend. It was with this heavier shift in place that Cowboys from Hell was written over a 6-month period from late 88 into 89. Now, to be clear, even though Cowboys would become their major label debut, they were still not actually signed at this point. Sure, they'd been on the radar of labels for years, but they had been rejected by them time and again. So when they got a call one weekend in September 1989 from Mark Ross, a representative from Atco Records, telling them he was in town and wanted to check them out after his planned trip to see another band was diverted due to Hurricane Hugo, no one in Pantera seemed to take the situation seriously. They'd been through this song and dance plenty of times already, and it never went anywhere. Plus, they didn't exactly have a traditional gig that night as they were performing at a birthday party, so they never expected Ross to show up. But when they arrived at the Mexican restaurant in Fort Worth where the party was, they couldn't help but notice the one guy who clearly stood out from the rest of the party goers. So, with a label representative in attendance, the band tried their best to be professionals until midway through the set, they noticed Ross was no longer there. Naturally, coming to the conclusion that he didn't like them and left, Pantera let loose and started throwing cake all over the place as they joined in on the party. That is, they did so until Ross unexpectedly came back, and they suddenly felt the need to act like serious professionals again. After they were done and they approached Ross to get his opinion, they were surprised by how enthusiastic he was, which led them to ask, "Why did you leave in the middle of the set?" To which Ross explained he had just gone out to his car to call his boss to let him know he was going to sign them. With this, the Pantera that was released upon the world was a far cry from their initial hair metal days with Terry Glaze. This version of Pantera combined the speed and aggression of thrash with heavy grooves, a result of their love of ZZ Top and the like, some southern rock influence, and a more simplified song structure. Meanwhile, vocally Anselmo brought forth some of the kind of screaming/growling vocals that had heretofore only really been present in more underground acts. With 1990's Cowboys from Hell and its follow-up vulgar display of power, Pantera were well on their way to becoming a massive success. In doing so, they stayed incredibly heavy, even as a lot of the original thrash bands from the 80s were going in different directions. Indeed, Pantera, if anything, seemed to be constantly attempting to get a heavier, more brutal sound. According to Vinnie Paul, quote, "After Vulgar, everybody expected us to go the Metallica route and put out a black album, and we did the opposite. We even went more extreme and pushed it to another level." Pantera's music was aggressive and harsh, but it still had a groove-focused rhythm section. It married some of Thrash's speed with a more primal back-to-basics approach to the riffs, and melded that with Anselmo's harsh growling vocals. What Pantera became then was something wholly different from the grunge bands and from the thrash bands that had come before. They produced a more aggressive and more extreme type of metal, but they were only the tip of the iceberg for that particular strain. The extreme metal movement would seemingly be largely built off the basis of thrash metal. They would basically take what the thrash bands were doing and then take it another step further. One of the main identifiers of this form of metal is the vocals. Instead of some form of singing, the vocals are more akin to guttural screams, completely lacking in melody, with the idea being that this made the music heavier or more brutal than what came before it. You can actually go all the way back to Venom as one of the first bands to pioneer this style. Under the umbrella of the extreme metal designation are any number of further subgenres. One, grindcore, would develop and of all places the hometown of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest. Grindcore was inspired by the speed of thrash and hardcore punk's focus on real-world issues. Napalm Death, the pioneers of this new style of metal, played faster and screamed louder than anyone that came before them. In doing so, they also pushed further toward rejecting the conventions of music, as they not only stripped away melody, but also the traditions of song structure. They would also develop the blast beat, which would become integral to the sound of extreme metal from then on. Their debut, Scum, while unpolished, was so extreme in its speed and noise level that it turned heads even among those jaded by thrash. Napalm Death would then be joined by another band, Carcass, who would take things a step further by introducing disturbing images and lyrics with the intent of making people uncomfortable. Yet by their third album, Carcass realized that their ultra-fast, ultra-detuned sound was no longer transgressive, so they would switch things up and go for a more melodic guitar sound, inspiring a whole new group of bands in the process. Back in the States, meanwhile, another underground extreme metal movement was getting started that would become known as death metal, a style that seems to be more technically focused than grindcore had been. This specific growth of the heavy metal sound can potentially be attributed to the fact that, as Ian Christie points out in his book, the musicians who would form the early foundation of death metal had grown up in a world where heavy metal was already a thing. As a result, where previous generations were initially inspired by the blues and bluesy hard rock, and then took those inspirations and made them heavier and more complex, this new group were essentially looking back at actual heavy metal bands and looked to make that sound heavier and more complex. Now, the origins of death metal are apparently debated. Some, for example, credit the band Possessed. Indeed, they even released a demo called Death Metal in 1984. Now, for Possessed, who were just a bunch of high school kids, what they were doing just seemed like a natural progression from what was already going on at the time. You see, they came out of San Francisco like so many other thrash bands. So, with groups like Exodus and Slayer already being huge hits among the local metal community, it just seemed to make sense to take things a step further with even more growly guttural vocals. As a result, their 1985 release 7 Churches is considered by some to be the first death metal album. Others, however, consider it to be more proto-death metal as well as close, it's just not quite death metal yet. Such individuals then are more likely to turn their attention away from San Francisco to, of all places, Florida, as they credit one Chuck Schuldiner and his band Death as being the true pioneers of death metal. Now, depending upon your source, you either get a picture of a person who was a bit paranoid and in general so difficult to work with he was the sole reason why the band went through so many lineup changes, while other write-ups mention none of these issues, with one even describing him as a mellow, laid-back, polite, and charismatic guy. Where the actual truth lies, I can't say. I just honestly don't know enough about the band, as I personally just can't get past the vocals of this style of metal. Now, if I was doing an episode purely about the band, I'd try and dig deeper to get a more complete picture, but for right now, I can't say with any authority. What is less disputed is that Chuck was often credited as being way ahead of his time. Indeed, by 1991, he even started moving past the initial blueprint of death metal that he had established with the band's 4th album, Human, as his music became increasingly complex and jazzy. Basically, it seems that he not only established death metal, but then started innovating further, creating something beyond his original creation. That being said, Chuck was also reportedly quite humble. He didn't see himself as creating anything particularly unique or groundbreaking, even though many others credit him for pioneering new ground in extreme metal. He just thought what he was doing was making heavy metal pure and simple. Indeed, he would give credit to new wave of British heavy metal band Venom for being the ones who really pioneered that kind of more brutal, aggressive sound. He was, after all, heavily influenced by their album Welcome to Hell, and his initial band was even named Mentas after the stage name of Venom's guitarist. Chuck, though, despite his humbleness, does seem to have been not only very influential, but also very innovative, as beyond pushing the bounds of death metal, he would eventually ditch one of the most defining elements of the genre that he helped to create, the brutal growling vocals, when he formed Control Denied and handed over vocal duties to Tim Aymar, who actually sang over the music that Chuck was creating. Control Denied, however, would only create a singular album, The Fragile Art of Existence, before Chuck was diagnosed with a rare brainstem cancer. With the help of fans raising tens of thousands of dollars, Chuck would receive what was hoped to be a life-saving operation, as without their help, thanks to our wonderful for-profit medical care system, he likely could not have afforded the treatment. A treatment that initially seemed to be successful. Unfortunately, the cancer eventually came back worse than ever, but once again the community rallied to help, with bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Korn, and even a young Trivium doing what they could to help raise money to pay for Chuck's medical bills. Unfortunately, though, there was seemingly nothing that the doctors could do, and Chuck Schuldiner would die on the 13th of December 2001 at just 34 years old. Now, to be clear, Chuck and his band Death were not the only ones creating this more brutal style of heavy metal. Indeed, they weren't even the only death metal band to come out of Florida during that early foundational period. Morbid Angel, for example, was another early death metal band that formed and took shape in that most open and accepting of states, Florida. Indeed, it seems from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, Tampa of all places was the epicenter of death metal. Why this happened, no one is really sure. Some credit it as a rebellion against the dominant ultra-conservative religious culture of the area, while others say it was simply the heat making the metal musicians down there just a bit mad. Regardless, death metal was defined by extremely fast, oftentimes down-tuned guitars played through a kind of buzzing distortion, low guttural vocals with oftentimes graphic lyrics, and highly technical drumming, noted for its blast beat and crisp double bass tone. This specific soundscape was defined in Tampa's Morris Sound Studios, as owner Tom Morris and especially producer Scott Burns spent a lot of time figuring out how to mic the drums in such a way that the rapid-fire bass-heavy drum sound remained clear and distinct. It was then this studio and his proven reputation for knowing how to make this extreme type of metal sound good that would draw a lot of other bands to the area, further cementing its status as a mecca of death metal. In fact, death metal bands Cannibal Corpse and Malevolent Creation both started in Buffalo, New York, but would move to Florida in no small part due to the reputation of Morris sound. Now, these bands for the most part would not reach the same level of success as a number of the metal bands that preceded them, with some blaming grunge for being the cause of their relative lack of success, which on some level I see, as the Seattle bands had provided a catchier, more approachable heavy style of music that captured the public's attention and potentially took it away from more traditional and even more extreme versions of heavy metal. Basically, they weren't able to provide a more serious alternative to hair metal while still managing to be approachable by the masses. At the same time, though, it's called extreme metal for a reason. It's a style very much outside the classic norms of popular music. It's music that is purposely made to sound as harsh and as brutal and as almost unmusic as possible. This very much includes the vocals, as they are purposely stripped of any kind of melodic sense, which is also where they kind of lose me and I guess many others. Extreme metal then is almost by design a niche product. Regardless of what other music is being made, it's going to have its fans. But at the same time, I think there is a kind of ceiling over how big such groups can get. Now, there is one important thing to note about this specific genre that I haven't really touched on yet, and that's their lyrics. You see, unlike most of the thrash bands who had distanced themselves from satanic imagery, death metal very much embraced the idea of creeping people out with evil imagery and lyrics. Cannibal Corpse, who would become the biggest band to come out of the death metal scene, for example, went for shock value with gory album covers and lyrics, which, while appealing to their fans, also garnered the band negative attention from time to time. For example, Bob Dole, during his failed presidential run, would blame what he perceived as a decline in culture and society on groups like Cannibal Corpse in particular. He and his allies' goal then was to publicly shame the band, but instead they just gave them publicity. The group then got even more publicity when, at the request of Jim Carrey, they took part in his Ace Ventura movie. Heavy metal then in all its various forms was finding more and more of a home in the mainstream, yet there were still those who rejected its very existence. Whether they saw it as the literal music of the devil or just the cause of all of society's ills, metal would remain a scapegoat for a certain segment of the population. Not much then had changed since the earliest days of the genre. For example, fundamentalist Christian leaders in the 90s still gathered up heavy metal records from the young people in their congregations and burned them just like they had done back in the 70s with Black Sabbath albums. The war on heavy metal then was clearly still ongoing. Some of these battles would be fought on the small scale at the local level with school dress codes and the like. Others, meanwhile, would take their issues to the masses. For example, Cardinal John O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York in 1990, would claim he had knowledge of reports of growing satanic cult activity among the youth. The Cardinal would even claim that there had been 2 exorcisms successfully performed in the New York Archdiocese in the past year. As for what was responsible for this rise in satanic activity, well, he asserted that heavy metal music could, quote, help trap people, especially teenagers, into dabbling in satanic practices. In particular, the Cardinal denounced Ozzy Osbourne's tune Suicide Solution, to which Ozzy responded by stating that the Cardinal had, quote, insulted the intelligence of rock fans all over the world. But the Cardinal wasn't alone in his beliefs, apparently. For one, a Father Rento of New Jersey, a so-called expert in Satanism, said that music, quote, was one of the factors helping to create a climate in which the hitherto unthinkable becomes thinkable. Whatever that means. You also had other supposed authority figures like Dr. Dale Griffith, a former Ohio State policeman and self-proclaimed cult expert, who would assert that murderous underground satanic cults were threatening America and recruiting from the heavy metal scene. Police departments even had a book called Youth Subcultures to help them profile people with. The section on heavy metalists reads, quote, this category covers a wide age range, perhaps from 8 to 24. Currently, it is the largest group in most schools. They are heavy drug users. Many are not motivated to do much of anything constructive. They get their drug money from thefts and from dealing drugs themselves. Some, of course, would seek to profit off this paranoia. Companies like Back in Control Training Center advertised that they could de-punk or de-metal troubled teens to bring them back in line with fundamentalist Christian beliefs. Their founder would also emphasize the importance of this process because, according to him, over 90% of the people who listened to heavy metal had drug issues. Then there were the private youth detention centers that had become a growth industry in the 80s. These institutions encouraged parents and municipalities to enroll troublesome children into their tough love programs to shake off the effects of the occult, which was the generic source of all of life's issues. Yet, even though many would be shut down in the 90s following Department of Justice investigations for rights violations, others are still free to operate as they rake in significant profits. Now, some would even take their fight against heavy metal into the courtroom. In 1988, Ozzy Osbourne, one of the founding fathers of heavy metal, would be brought to court with the claim that his aforementioned song Suicide Solution was to blame for a California boy's suicide after a Black Sabbath record was found playing in the room with his body. Mind you, the song in question was one Ozzy recorded as a solo artist, and not as a member of Black Sabbath, so the record that was found in the room didn't even have the song on it. However, Kenneth McKenna, the lawyer who brought the case against Ozzy, would contend through elaborate digital examination that there were hidden messages in the track, while Osbourne's lawyer argued that the actual message of the song was about the dangers of alcoholism that nearly killed Ozzy and had killed his friend Bon Scott. Now, McKenna's case would fail, but it had garnered tons of publicity, so he would try again in 1991 with another lawsuit, this time against Judas Priest, as he once again claimed that the band had put subliminal messages into their music to convince their listeners to commit suicide. Rob Halford, the singer of Judas Priest, however, would provide the perfect response, as he asked why would they want to kill their fans. That's not a successful business model. If they were going to put subliminal messages in their songs, the messages should be telling people to go buy more records. Unsurprisingly, though, little has changed since, as we're still dealing with this kind of attitude today. For example, November 2018 in Midland, Texas, a pastor organized a prayer gathering to protect the city from the quote dark spiritual influences of the band Ghost, who were scheduled to perform a show there in a few days. Now, Ghost is another in a long line of bands to play with occult imagery for entertainment purposes. Their whole gimmick is their singer and band leader dresses up like an undead pope-like figure and sings about their love of Satan and similar subject matter. Now, the pastor in question claimed that he did not want to outlaw the band. He just seemed to want to prevent them from being able to perform. Basically, his excuse was, I don't want to outlaw them, I just want to make it so they can't perform or make money, so they just cease to exist. The pastor was criticizing the venue and conducting this prayer because not only did he believe the devil was real, but he was also convinced the band actually worshipped Satan. As such, the poor innocent young people going to the concert would be putting themselves at risk by singing along with the band's occult lyrics, because according to this pastor, quote, who knows what in the world they're opening their hearts and lives up to? Suffice it to say, though, the pastor seemed to accomplish little but to bring publicity to the show and onto himself, which may have been his goal the whole time. So, try as they might to eliminate it, metal is still out there. There's nothing dangerous about it, it's just another form of entertainment. Indeed, in many ways, it's just another part of the culture now. Meanwhile, metal has splintered into numerous subgenres, and even then they don't capture the complexity of any given band. As a result, there are so many branching paths that can be argued that metal nowadays is more about not being limited by rules. Metal can encompass and incorporate aspects of any number of other styles and genres, giving them a new heavy twist in the process. You have bands like Gojira out of France who are combining elements of extreme metal with spiritual and environmental messages, while some bands like Corrosion of Conformity incorporate the sounds of southern rock with heavy metal. Then you have a band like Mastodon that combines aspects of sludge metal with 70s prog rock, or even Opeth, who went from being a blacker death metal band to incorporating prog, folk, classical, and jazz into their sound. With the internet, there's heavy music out there for all different kinds of taste. You could even listen to Viking or pirate metal if that's your thing. It's all out there, you just have to find it. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.